So welcome, Sandrine. I have Sandrine on joining me today for Better Speech and Hearing Month. I decided to kind of create these events throughout the month to talk about dynamic assessment and working with multilingual, multicultural families. And so I'm going to ask you, Sandrine, if you can please introduce yourself. We would love to hear who you are. Share us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on. And yes, Better Speech and Hearing Month to everyone. Yeah, so I'm a speech therapist just like you, Melissa, and I work in the private sector. I've been working in the private sector since I graduated, but I worked also in rehab centers, and I've worked in schools for specialized kids. And also my practice for the last 10 years has also brought me to work with Indigenous communities up north, on the North Shore of Quebec. Pretty much most of my practice has been there. And in my private practice today, which is situated in the so-called Gatineau area near Ottawa, we have a business in which we see obviously kids of all ages, some adults as well. And due to the proximity to Ottawa, we do have some Anglophone kids and some kids obviously with just how the world is now and is so diverse. Then we also have kids who speak different languages, obviously, that we see. And
Yes.
yeah, that's my thing. And bilingualism and multilingualism is one of my favorite subjects to talk about. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on because it's definitely an area of interest of mine. If anyone doesn't know me, I'm also a speech language pathologist practicing. I've been in private practice for about 9 years, and I've developed really an area of interest in multilingual, multicultural families, being myself trilingual, mom of two bilingual kids, growing up in a multilingual environment and finding myself in my private practice and going into daycare, supporting educators and teachers. And these questions are often coming up, how do we work with these kids, getting a lot of referrals, questioning around whether these children are developing typically or if they really truly have language difficulties. And to celebrate Better Speech and Hearing Month, I thought I would love to better support my colleagues because I do also offer workshops, and I think you do too. You're a speaker, you've presented many times on this topic. So I think that dynamic assessment is not something that we speak about enough, in my opinion. And I wanted to, bring more awareness about this topic and have guests on that have less and more experience with this. I had a guest on a few days ago, and she was practicing in Lebanon and has come to Quebec. So she had a nice view to share with that, how she kind of like stumbled upon this dynamic assessment by herself. So to kick it off, I wanted to ask you, this year, the topic for Better Speech and Hearing Month is communication is. This is the tagline in Canada. So I would love for you to tell me what your definition of communication is.
Right. I think communication for me is beautiful. It's what we need. It's what makes us human. But I'd say that I feel like communication for me is relationships and culture, right? I feel like through communication we can share so much culture. I don't think culture is only defined by communication and the way we speak, but I think there is so much to learn from others, hence the relationship part as well. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yes, I love that. It's true that the relationship is so important and learning, as you said, right? Where I feel like we're always learning from our peers, learning from the families we work with. And I think that's a really good jump-starting point. So what would you say is the way that you learn best from families that you work with that come from different cultural backgrounds than yours? How do you, make that connection with the families?
Yeah, I think that part is so important in our field because when we go to school we're taught like this is how assessments are done. This is how, when you see your clients, those are the steps you're going to take: step 1, step 2, step 3. And I realize that sometimes, because we're so keen on following all those steps, we may forget the most part, which is that relationship building. Like, we think about it, we know it's important, but sometimes it's as if we don't know how much space we can make for it. And I like to make space for that. And I feel like that's how I learn the most. It's when I actually sit down, whether it's new clients or current clients, but I have some sessions in which I'm going to be more in the listening and hearing and having conversations with them to hear about how they're feeling in this journey in speech therapy and communication, better communication. And I feel like when I do that, that's where they give me so much interesting information that feeds either my assessment or how I view the kid now or how I can better help the family moving on.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. Like creating that bond is so important. And I feel like you said, maybe younger practice, we sometimes get a little bit focused on, okay, we need to do like X, Y, and Z, and here are my tasks, and I've made my list and I'm going down my checklist. But as we're like moving along in our career or personally, I found that, okay, Mel, it's time to take a step back and really listen and ask the right questions and connect with the families and learn about them. And like you said, we learn so much valuable information. And so diving right into speaking about dynamic assessment, what, what generally speaking, like what's your experience with dynamic assessment? How would the information that you collect from families while you're getting to know them culturally and linguistically, how would that inform or direct your dynamic assessment? Like, what are you doing with that, the information that you're gathering?
That's a good question. I think it's super important to, when we meet those families, to think about the assessment as, we used to say the assessment before I delved into dynamic assessment. I used to tell the parents, like, the assessment is like just a picture, and that 1 hour I spent is just a picture of your child at this moment. I'm going to make it as close to what your child or how you see your child as possible, but obviously it's only a picture in time. It's not moving, and we're going to move with that. And I find that with dynamic assessment is that it's not a picture anymore that we have to use. It's more like a movie. I like to use kind of like that analogy, because now you can look at how the child responds to how you're teaching them new things and how they're acquiring those new methods or strategies that you're teaching them. So I think that's what's really interesting about dynamic assessment. In my profession, so the way we work, I think dynamic assessment, mostly we've started using it with my team because I have other speech therapists who work with me, and we offer services assessment, including to some Indigenous communities, in community mostly, as well as the academic community. So what happens, one of the main things for me that I thought that I liked to be able to do was to be able to offer them good intervention before coming up with the report. So kind of having like a first idea through conversation with parents and asking the right questions, because that's really hard, especially when the language structures are so different, to ask parents what's the issue in the language of the child. Because if I use some words that we would use, let's say in English or French, those don't translate in the Innu languages or in the Atikamekw language. It doesn't translate. And I've had parents who ask me, what do you mean sentence, his sentence? Like, what do you mean? So I really had to find ways to ask the right questions during my interviews with the parents. And that was challenging, and it's still challenging for the newer members in our team sometimes.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I actually haven't worked myself with the Indigenous communities. I've had a lot of participants in my groups where I'm teaching about, best practices working with multilingual families. And I've read a few articles, where there were questions asked to these communities on how best to connect with them because of the history they have with, healthcare and healthcare services and, the expert or the power. So how did you develop this way of asking questions and connecting and doing this intervention before actually, which is, in other words, your assessment. It's your dynamic assessment, right? This is what you're doing.
Yeah.
So how did you did this take you 10 years to develop? Like, how did you
Almost. I feel like we're always developing. We're always like thinking on our feet. We're always trying to figure out better ways to do things with our team. So we're always kind of renewing our methods with whatever comes out in evidence-based. But I'd say that my first 5 years had no idea what I was doing. I was really just trying to figure it out. So what I did those first 5 years was do most my standardized assessment, which when I look at my reports now, I say, oh my goodness, what was I doing? But that's all I knew. That's all I had. But through my visits, because it's quite far, I had to, so I had to spend the time in the community often. I would just kind of go to events and spend time walking around and meeting people and just kind of listening to the way they talk and listening to the way to what's important to them and listening to the values that I could see, watching families play together, families spend time together. Because even the idea of play can be different in different cultures, right? So that's mostly what I did. I think it's through making connections outside of just the clients that I would have to see. It's also kind of going into the community and spending time and learning and paying attention to those little cues. Yeah, that's what helped me the most.
That's incredible. And so did you find that doing this, you were able to gain the trust of the people that you were working with as people were getting to know you and see you around in the community? Did this impact what you were doing in your work in your office with the families that you're working with?
As I said, I'm so privileged and I feel so humbled to have had that experience and to continue to have that experience as we continue working with those communities. But I do bring it back 100%. What you said is right on the ball. Everything that I learned from them is just kind of a different view and different perspective on how we see communication and language. And I find that through the way that I'm assessing nowadays, I tend to go to that route as well. So, for example, for something concrete, for example, is that since I want to spend more time intervening, so what I started doing at the clinic is that now we have kind of SLP assistants who, after doing a small, quick assessment, they give the intervention before we bring out the full report. So as much as possible, we try to do the same thing. But also it helped me kind of remember to take the time and slow down when I'm interviewing parents and when I'm having conversations with parents and taking the time. Because sometimes we're in private and we think that parents, they're paying for the time that they're spending with us. And we're thinking that what they want is that paper and our notes and our conclusions and what is going to be is it going to affect the diagnostic of some sort? But what I realized is when I actually take the time, the parents come out of my office with such a deepened connection with each other. We have that, but also with a better understanding of exactly what their needs are, just because we took the time to converse, we took the time to talk. Even though the child is with us, we give them a little toy to play in the meantime, but because the way the parent is feeling is going to affect the way the child is feeling always, and also it's going to affect their motivation to continue working on whatever strategies we give them. So that's what it gave me, like the taking the time and going slower and listening. Yeah.
Take home message, taking the time. So bringing it back, you were saying that you see it kind of like a movie, like it's playing out, right? So is this what you've brought back from working with the Indigenous communities? Is this what you do with all of your clients? Would you say that you kind of do this little screener and you intervene immediately before jumping into a report? And how do you find that parents are responding to this? That you're taking the time, you're creating the connection, but is there any point where you feel pressed where parents are like, okay, but now I need to know what's happening? Or how are they responding to this type of difference in service? Because I feel like parents often come with an idea of what they're going to expect. Like, here, I'm bringing you my child. Maybe this is more Eurocentric as well. Depends, I guess, culturally. But some parents will come and expect a type of healthcare service like they would elsewhere. Like, they might have identified a problem. Someone else might have identified a difficulty. They're coming to see us and they're like, okay, here, now what do I do? So how are they responding to this different service offer that you're giving them?
I would say that generally they respond quite well to it. However, there are cases where they're really all they need right now is to have access to certain services, and as I know, or certain having a reference in terms of like specialized programs, in terms of the CIS and CS and like the public services, right? Or it's so blatantly evident that, for example, a child is nonverbal, then it's quite easy when it's very severe, to be able to say, like, you know what, I'm going to give you access to, at least some subsidies and whatnot.
Right.
So in those cases, then I might produce a report a bit faster. But generally, I often ask the parents why they came here, not only what they're worried about, because sometimes we ask them what they were worried about in terms of communications, and they'll tell us, oh, my child doesn't understand. No, I don't understand him well, or I don't know, he can't make friends, whatever. But then I ask them, okay, so timeline, who is this report for? And I start talking about those tests, and then I actually also take the time to educate about what the services are. So for example, well, he's not in school yet. Okay, so who is this report for? We want the report for when he starts school. Let's say right now I have a child who starts school in September. So I'm like, let's give him this intervention. Let's help him. And while we're helping him, let's see what helps and what doesn't help, so that at the end of the report will be way more solid, and we'll have a movie report instead of a picture report. And usually when they understand, like, who is this for, who's the big huge report for, and that we all have the same goal, that it's for this person, it's going to be for this moment, and that we also educate on our system, education and health, then usually, like, we come to a consensus quite easily.
I love this. What you're describing to me sounds a little bit like a mix of dynamic assessment, which I think is something that's shorter in time. Like people always ask me, like, how long should it take? Is this very long, or should we do dynamic assessment on all the linguistic elements? But what you're describing sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, as kind of a response to intervention, like what we would do with school-age children for reading and writing. So for people who want to know these, like, in our field, we're type A's. We always get that question, okay, but how long? So how long are you seeing these kids when you're doing this period of intervention to then write a report, which will be a movie-like report describing how the child is responding to intervention, I guess a more short-term period. So like, how are you structuring your kind of screening, intervention, and then your movie report?
So it really depends. Like I said, it depends on what's the report for and when it's for. So it can vary. It can be a 2-month period to a 3-month period to a 6-month period even. So when I do response to intervention type of scenarios, it can be all the way up to 6 months. But the parents the whole time have access to me. They can ask me questions. We can see what's going on. They have the strategies to work on at home. They see progress, and then my role is to judge how fast, right? And with which tools the progress is going. But the main thing is that usually we always see progress. And I think often the parents come for that. They want to see progress in their children. Yeah. And that's the main thing. But because in our medical way of thinking, it's often we need a report, we need diagnostics, we need these things. When we have a conversation, all of a sudden we're able to see that, well, maybe I don't need that right away. Maybe I need that a bit later. And now I know what I need it for. So that would be like my response to intervention. It depends exactly like what age. So if I have preschool age kids, if they come at the age of 3, sometimes I need something for the daycare because they're going to ask for some subsidies at the daycare. But then that'll be a bit faster. If they're at the age of 4 and they're starting preschool, kindergarten soon, then maybe it's going to be over the year, over a couple of months. It depends.
I love that you're adding, that's something I haven't thought about adding in my protocol is asking the parents, like, what is this for? Because I often will guide them in kind of, or helping them understand, what's language for you? What is communication? We'll break things down depending on their level of knowledge when they come in, what types of questions they have. But I love that you're asking them. Often we'll know what the report is for, but asking the parent, what are you coming in for? What do you want to get out of this? Where is this report going, for example, or what you want to do with it? I think that's a really nice way of starting, because that really does give us an idea of if we can do things a little bit faster, or if we can take some more time, as we said, that's so important for creating that connection. And that's definitely something I'm going to be adding also to my practice. I feel like I always kind of put in a timeline, but like you, it could be longer, it could be shorter. I think I've been more involved myself in these shorter, timely dynamic assessments, where I'll do kind of static dynamic, or no static tasks, depending. So How would you then interpret results? If you can give us some examples, because I know people are always wondering, okay, so then what do I do depending if I have a younger child or a school-aged child, if it's taking longer, or what if there is progress? So what are you doing with the information you're gathering, and how do you interpret this information?
So I think when they're younger, I think it's so much easier for us to know because we have those developmental milestones that are quite clear. Usually it's going to be, I'm going to look at those developmental milestones. I'm going to see like, yes, a lot of progress with this much help. However, still always falling short. Are we 3 months, 6 months away from the milestone, and I'm looking at and gauging that to be able to talk about the amount of like the persistence, but also the severity of the impacts, right? But also functionally, what are the
Yeah.
parents telling me that they see that's different at home and at the daycare? So I know in Quebec now, severity has to be like on the functional, the way that it affects daily life, right? That functional
Yeah.
impact, as we say. So the way it affects daily lives for children or adults that we see. So that's why I consider all of that. But it is trickier for school-age children, I had to say. I agree. Because our milestones are less clear. So I would look at the amount of input that they needed to be able to do the tasks at hand according to my objectives. But also, for example, like if I give the example of reading and writing, there may be time that I may decide at the end of whatever period that static period of time, that intervention period of time, that I may
Yeah.
choose a static assessment just at the end, but to see that one thing. And often, for example, like reading speed or when we're talking about reading and writing, obviously, or just to make sure that I get, the components that I'm missing in terms of what we see that's correlated with, for example, dyslexia and learning disabilities. So I might do some rapid automated naming tasks. So I'll have like maybe a few statics near the end for my older ones, just to make sure that there's what I feel, but I want to see also what's going on over there.
Wow, this is great advice. I think especially for younger SLPs who are starting off, who are more in those static tasks, that they can know that they can do intervention, and then they can also do some little verification things. And I think, like you said, you want to know functionally how the child is doing, what type of support and the amount of support that the child needs. But also we need to take like a holistic look at this functional aspects in all different areas. Sometimes maybe for school age children, for SLPs working in school, we may forget a little bit about how the child is functioning outside of the school and be so focused on their academic achievements and their academic performance. But taking that time to intervene, working with the parents is so important. And so how do you then choose when you have a child whose first language is, their home language is not the majority language? How do you choose to do your intervention? Does this have an impact? So let's say, how much time would you expect the child to be exposed to their second language or third to the majority language before you can say, okay, yeah, I can do intervention in this language and do tests in this language? I think this is the question that comes up very often as well, is like, it's so heterogeneous when we see these kids. They've all got different linguistic experiences, cultural experiences that impact, and so many other factors that come into play. So how do you consider linguistic and cultural experience when deciding how to intervene?
Oh my
I don't know
goodness.
if this is too broad of a question, but
It's a great question. It's a great question. But yeah, we could talk for 3 hours on this
I
subject.
know.
It's with me. But yeah, okay, let's keep it simple. So when do I decide that I can use or standardize tests or tests in the majority language pretty much with the trash? So when they're much younger, I'm gonna go preschool versus school aged. And then it's school age I'm gonna separate into. So preschool age, I very, very seldom use standardized testing. I'm going to be more in a dynamic type assessments, more like what I've heard you talk about in the previous talks that you've had. So really playing with them. If I see that the pronoun isn't used, I'm gonna give it one time, see if I have to repeat more than once before to see if I have to add multi-kinesthetic and see how they're doing. really that dynamic assessment as we know it, and see what sticks, what doesn't stick. So preschool age, I would say I don't tend to use those types of tests often at all. Very seldom. Now school age. Now we tend to have to kind of, well, we don't have to, but we tend to want to go there.
Yeah.
So then there's oral language, and then I would say that there's reading and writing as well. So for oral language, I would say that I have to remind everybody that it takes 5 to 7 years before we can compare a child who's monolingual, so those that have been used in our standardized tests and static tests, with a child who has more than one language, that is exposed to more than one language, is multilingual. So in those cases, I may try to take as long as possible before I do that. But sometimes it's important. It's impossible because I am asked to give up a report with percentiles and severities and things that we don't necessarily. It's harder to judge. So in those cases, I'm going to go towards the more of the dynamic assessment as much as possible with a mix of static tests, just because I know them, but just to give myself an idea of what's being able to be, what's produced by the child.
Yeah.
So I would ideally, in the best of all, like in the best world, we would always wait like 5 to 7 years of expositions before even using one of our standardized tests or static tests that's in one language, or oral language, so for expressing expressive and receptive skills.
So before we jump into maybe reading and writing, if you wanted to add a little on that, in some of the readings that I've done, I've read 7 to 10 years. So when we look at like morphological, like morphemes, vocabulary, screed that is required for cognitive, academic language, I'm seeing even that 7 might even be the bottom of the cutoff, up to 10 years. It could be even all the way up to, for in Quebec for us, up to the end of elementary school. So for a child who's aged 11, 12.
Yeah.
So are you seeing even these cutoffs? Because we know that for microstructure, narrative microstructure requires vocabulary, good oral language, morphological morphemes to be well developed. And if the home language doesn't have these like verbal inflections, for example, it could take a lot longer. Difficulties or some of these quirks might stay always, and these are just bilingual differences and not related to a disorder at all. So how do we know? Like, how do we make this distinction? Is it dynamic assessment that is helping you really know this? What are you, again, how are you interpreting the results to really say for certain this is a difference and not a disorder?
Yeah, so I'm going to use those static assessments because, that's like, it's still hard, right, to kind of remove completely some of those static assessments, especially for, like I said, I'm talking really our team when we talk together as well. Like I have younger ones, I have younger SLPs and older, more experienced ones. So we kind of try to mix, and what I see is that it can be hard. So obviously I'm never going to tell someone that it's wrong if you use it, right? It's not wrong to use static assessment. It's just about how you use it and how you interpret it. So for example, if we use them, what we'll do is we'll look at the results. And then when the results are so below what we expect for that age, I'm going to look at the language structure. So you have to have your references to have that. There's a lot of good references in terms of language structures that compare, let's say, with French. That's easy to find, and English as well. Then I'm going to see, okay, those are things that actually have no similarities in those languages. Then my third step is going to be, because I have to explain that it's too late. Like we can't do a dynamic assessment because we've only seen the child once. We might end up having to discuss with the parents and have an interview with the parents and talk about these things in their home language. Or if they're in a school that has people who speak that language, it's going to be about finding people who can talk to us about that specific aspect.
Right, in their home language.
So it's about having those best questions. But ideally is that we're able to go back, and now we're going to do an activity on that specific thing. So I like the idea of grammar, like you were saying, morphological markers, for example. So we're going to use sentence building, like little games that we have. We can do it. We have tools that have all the way up to physical tools to help the child build their sentences. So what we'll do is at first we're gonna kind of give them the picture, see what we already know what they model from our static tests. Now we're gonna give it to them with the model, see how they're doing. If it's not enough, we're gonna give them the extra visual cues, and eventually we're gonna have them with the objects for the visual cues and see how they respond to it. So that would be a way of kind of validating or invalidating our results on a static test.
And do you find that doing a task like the one that you just gave the example of may be biased for certain cultures? You know, having worked with Atikamekw culture, the Innu, you know, do you find that these tasks that we're doing, are they valid? Like, what kind of response have you seen doing these very, I want to say again, Eurocentric type of way we interact with, you know, the adult interacting with the child, the adult questioning the child? Have you had times that parents have said to you, like, what are you doing? Or do parents jump in if this is not typical of something that they would do back home? Can you talk to us about that?
Right. I don't think most parents jump in. I haven't had that happen that much.
Right.
However, I work with interpreters often.
Yes.
So I often have someone who speaks the language when I'm doing my assessments all the time when I'm in those communities, for sure. So it's easier because it's a homogeneous language, right? I know that Montreal can be different if you work in a school setting, but over there it's a homogeneous home language usually, community. So if I find an interpreter to work with me the whole time, then usually it's easy enough. But yes, the reason why we have interpreters as well is they're not only interpreters, they actually play with the child. They actually help us do our assessments and everything. So funny story is that when I started, one of the first person I had worked with who was an interpreter had told me, after I was kind of showing her like, okay, this is how we do speech therapy. And then I sit with a child and I do that verbal bombardment that we do, which is like, okay, we talk, like we say the word and we say it super loudly and like with more emphasis, and we add extra gestures and we're super illuminated and putting like all those facial as well nonverbal cues for them to look at us. When I came out of there, she told me, well, you're overstimulating the child. What are you doing? I was told that once. And yeah, you have to learn to be quite humble and accept the critique. And since then, what I learned is that we can let the child, kind of like things that we know, we can let the child lead the play and just kind of add on to what the child is doing. Nothing crazy, nothing that we've never seen, nothing that we've never done, but kind of having this more gentle and less exuberant approach. But I would say that that's because I had a very good kind of interesting, a good connection with that person. She felt comfortable enough to tell me that. But most parents want this regular speech therapy. And even within these communities, sometimes I have to explain what we have to discuss about the whole idea about the report, because sometimes they need it for something and we have to have those conversations. So yeah, I would say that it's important to be ready to receive an opinion that's different to what we do, even though we think we've learned this at a master's level. We've done, I mean, it's we studied in it, but it's one way of seeing how we can communicate and how we language and how we play. Even the way we play is also very Eurocentric. So we have to think about those things and accept the critique.
Absolutely. And that's what being culturally responsive is being able to be humble and know that we have biases in the way that we conduct ourselves, in the way we interact, in the way we play, in the way we ask our questions, or just everything, even the way like sentences are structured. Just talking about the Atikamekw language, when you were saying you were asking parents about sentences and they're like, well, what is that?
Because in their language, subject can come, it's not subject, verb, object, right? It can be object, subject, verb, object, verb, subject. So the order of words does not make it harder to understand necessarily. So that's where, coming back to your first question about dynamic assessment, can it be biased? Well, it's about seeing what the child can learn, and that's if the child has been exposed at least to those sentences enough, right? If they've been in school for, if they're in high school and everything, they should be able to kind of do a minimum of grammatical maneuvers and things that they don't per se use in their everyday language, but they're able to learn it. A good example is the he and she that we tend to teach a lot. So one of those things in those languages, there's no such thing. Therefore, and as they're not the only languages, right? There's so many languages that don't have the pronouns he and she. They don't differentiate between gender. One of the things that I do with my team and that we remind ourselves is that we may teach it because they need, if they're going to school in French, they need to know the difference. So I want them to be able to metalinguistically, so kind of be able to think about it when they need it, but I'm not going to wait to see it in their everyday speech to say that it's acquired.
Explain why you wouldn't do that, why you wouldn't wait for that.
So the idea of multilingualism is not only about those named languages that we know that we call like English and French and German. Those are the named languages, the ones that you know of, but it's also about including the dialects, right?
Yeah.
So the dialects of French and English, there are so many around Canada, right? There's so many French dialects in Quebec as well. So it's important to remember that those dialects are part of that multilingual characteristic of that child we're working with, and human beings as well as they age. Like you said it so well, Melissa, a lot of components, more morphological components as well, and syntax stay as we age, and we call those accents, right? So those dialects are to be cherished, are to be validated, and are to be accepted. And it's normal that if you have multiple languages that they may influence each other, which then creates dialects of the majority languages such as French and English, which is why if you see yourself, if the child is a bilingual in so and so language, well, they may keep that because that's part of their identity. Right. And never ever tell them that that's wrong, but we can tell them that this is great. Did you know that there's also the school French, right?
Right.
Because they're kids, right? So you're not going to say anything else in simple terms like school French and home French. Educate that there's dialect at home, that's good. And then there's dialect, that's cool. We'll see if you can do both. And if they're able to do both, then for me, we're happy and we're good. And he's going to be ready for school.
Beautiful. And how do you celebrate these differences between dialects with teachers who are questioning themselves, like, oh, this child has an accent or keeps making these errors, but really they're just transferences or interferences, we should say, from their L1 to their L2. Their L1 has a certain structure, or like you were saying that in the Innu languages, the word order doesn't really matter. It doesn't always, it will change. And so it doesn't always have an incidence on the complexity or comprehension of a certain structure. So in your experience, how have you celebrated or cherished this, not just with the families, because we, have our part to play with families to explain to them how this is important. We explain it to the tribe, we can explain it to the parents, like, okay, this is the home dialect. Let's see how your child responds when we try and teach them the school dialect so we can best prepare them for that. And then teachers will see this child and say, I'm hearing all these errors, or I'm hearing these, this Quebec accent, or these little things that just keep coming about conversationally. So how do you celebrate that and advocate for the child?
Usually if I'm able to be in the school setting, which I am often as well, I'm going to try to bring about ideas that touch translanguaging in terms in school, which is having activities in which the dialect, and especially when the teacher knows the dialect on top of it, right? Especially when it's like, for example, the Quebec dialect versus the French school dialect, right? The one in books, the one that's more. So what I'll try to get them to kind of do, for example, an exercise, like, for example, okay, let's write a story in which we're going to write the Quebec dialect for the way that the characters are going to speak.
Right.
In that story versus another one who doesn't speak that dialect, to kind of show them and contrast them. But that way because these kids see it on the board, because they see the teacher using it, it's validating their dialect. That's one good way of doing it, is simply kind of using it to create those contrasts in their brain and in the teachings so that they see that both can be celebrated. But right now we're kind of trying to teach them a new one that exists as well.
And you find that teachers are trained to be responsive to multilingual, multicultural children in this type of way, to work, like I said, with translanguaging, which we know can be really beneficial also for transferring certain elements or for their metalinguistic abilities to understand, oh yeah, and to kind of think in both languages. Oh yeah, this is happening like this in my language, in my home language. So, but it's kind of like this in the French language. Do you find that teachers are prepared for that or open to that? Those are two different things. Are they prepared for that, and are they open to that?
A lot of teachers are not prepared for them, and unfortunately, even if themselves have a multilingual background, because the way I think our society is so, how do we say, it's so monolingual, right? Our society is based on so many monolingual facts. That's what the base is, that's what the norm is. So I think, no, I don't think that they're prepared. I don't think that there's enough for them to be able to take it on without help. And I think that's why in school speech therapists, we have a perfect role for that. And now in terms of them being open, that's also a good question, because I don't think that all are open, because it is hard to it requires a kind of dismantling of everything that you've learned in terms of how you're going to teach a child in school. And it's also a dismantling of how to promote French, because in Quebec, we're very afraid of losing the French. French is spread. And some people say that it's receding. Unfortunately, it's not receding. But it is compared to Canada. French, Quebec is smaller than the rest of Canada. English is everywhere. So the fear of losing French makes it hard for teachers to be open to other languages in the classroom. That's what I see the most. And then when they're open, they're not prepared. So they need our guidance. And then that requires hours on our part. So we have to be ready to do that. And that requires a lot of mutual thinking, depending on what kind of classroom you have. Is it multilingual? Is it only 1 or 3 children? Is it all the children are like in the communities up north? They speak all the same language. So all of eyes are on us to be able to get our brain going and thinking and finding resources. But luckily, there are resources out there. But yeah, we need to have like step A, which is hard to get on, I have to say.
Yeah, I agree. I think here we in general, I think even stemming from standardized testing and the way we were taught in school how to conduct our practice, best practice, gold standard, it was very much to compartmentalize languages and compartmentalize each aspect when we really want to think about it as a whole and how everything is interacting. I think even in the medical model, when you really take a step back and look at the medical system, it's very compartmentalized, right? You go see one professional for one thing and another professional for another thing. And then you go see your speech therapist, and a lot of speech therapists are monolingual. And so they're like, well, I can only work on this. And they might be considering a little bit the other languages, which I was just reading an article about the different types of linguistic ideologies that school-based SLPs are using. Mm-hmm. And I think we have a lot of work to do, because it's kind of encrusted in the schooling system, in the political system. I can go.
The school cultures is hard to dismantle or to kind of reshape, I would say. I think one of the things that helps me, at least when I see that there's multilingual, is to at least get the teachers to not reprimand children who use their home language, even if there's 2 children that speak the same one. That's my first kind of battleground.
I was reprimanded a lot as a child. I grew up in a Arabic, English, French home, but majority we spoke more English, and then my mom would speak to me in Arabic a lot. And I don't know, French too, but somehow, I don't know, I picked up all the languages before going into school. But at school, I had friends who spoke English as well. They all spoke the same languages as me as well, but we spoke English a lot, and we got in so much trouble. I remember the more the teachers told us not to speak English, the more we wanted to speak English.
Exactly.
So I was like, why? What is your problem?
It defeats the purpose. It defeats the purpose if you punish a child who's speaking their home language, even if it's English. I know we want to keep the French, but just you are the model. Just answer in French, and that's it. Let the child be.
So what is your, if you had a trick that really gets teachers on board, because the same way we don't want to tell parents, don't do this, or a child, don't do that. We want to celebrate and encourage what they're doing, because we want them to get thinking about how they can do things differently, right? We bring them to that by accompanying them. Have you found something that really works, that really gets teachers to that aha moment where they're like, oh, I see what you're saying, that if we're celebrating that language, if we're firstly just not punishing them for using another language than French, what's been your go to? Is it a resource? Is it providing examples? Like, what works for you? What works best for you?
Yeah, I think analogies for me, and analogies that aren't really analogies, because research does show that language is what is part of what creates your identity and your culture. So often I kind of tell them about, our multilingualism, there's the studies. So I often go in terms of just the main data that it can be very beneficial for the child. And they often all agree, oh, really, I didn't know, or they agree, they tell me they knew that. So there's some kind of knowledge that does exist in most teachers in terms of multilingualism. They just don't know what to do about it in their classroom. They don't know what to do with
Right.
it. So
Like,
often, yeah.
sorry, then comes the part like, okay, then how do we change
Exactly.
behavior? The knowledge might be there, but how do we get them to kind of apply new behaviors to bring that knowledge into existence?
So what I do is I tell them, like, when that child is speaking out, when that child is speaking Mandarin, that's his home. You agree? He's like, yeah, that's his home. So that's his culture. Yeah, I agree. That's his culture. So that's his identity. It's part of him. Okay, so would you ever tell a child to come into the classroom and leave his identity out, his culture outside? So to come only with half or a third of himself? Well, no, that's you don't do that. Okay, well then I encourage you to not do that, because when you think you're just talking about the language, you're not talking about a child, but they're all intertwined and they
Right.
cannot be separated. So anytime you're going to comment on their language or dialect, you're going to be commenting on their identity and affecting their self-esteem, and then their disposition to learn French, but also everything else you want to teach them during your classroom.
Yeah.
So usually when I'm able to have that kind of conversation, I would tell you that most cases it works. Most cases it works.
I love that. That's a great analogy. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think everyone can benefit from these little tips and tricks that we can introduce. We've sometimes tried some things and see maybe pushback from teachers or educators. So as we're coming kind of to an end now of our hour, first of all, thank you so much for all of the knowledge that you've come to share. I wish we can speak for like so much longer. I love this topic. It's fascinating to me. I know that you've done a lot of a lot of learning in this field. Do you have any upcoming workshops or talks that we can follow if some people want to learn more? Like, where can we find you? Where can we know more and get more of your knowledge that you share with your SLP colleagues?
Right now I'm about to create my page, so I don't have yet a page, but you can follow. Usually I'm going to put up on my clinics page, if I do some speaking events, I'm going to put it on there. So if you follow Cabinet d'Orthophonie L'Envol, you're going to find our page and you'll be able to see if I have any speaking gigs. So far, no. Summertime is coming. I'm with interns, so I don't have anything planned. But yes, I would say if you follow that page, you'll be able to follow me. And you can find me on LinkedIn with my full name, Sandrine Umunoza. That's also where you could see some of my upcoming workshops.
Wonderful. And if I have one last little thing to leave off with, kind of stemming from this topic, but a little veering off. As we're well into 2024, we know that I'm going to ask you about artificial intelligence is coming about. I personally really been tweaking and working a lot with it. We do have an AI that has been built for us by one of our Quebec colleagues. It's called Natalie AI. I've been using her to do so many things, but what do you think do you think that AI could be something that SLPs can use to help work with families from diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds? Do you think that this is something that we should be leaning into to some extent? Maybe this is not something you've thought about before. I don't know. I was curious to have your input on that.
I actually hadn't thought about it, but as we've been talking, and I'm realizing that, I'm gonna say time is money, but what I mean is I know that a lot of speech pathologists, we tend to not want to dive into dynamic assessment and multilingual assessment and having a hard time sometimes figuring how I can do it if I don't speak all those languages. I guess we could use AI, I'm thinking, to just kind of get access much more quickly to the differences and interferences between languages, actually. So for example, asking, could you tell me what are the similarities and the differences between Spanish and English? for the sentence structure, for example? Or could you find me a resource that has this information about phonology? I don't know. That's what I'm thinking off the bat. That could be kind of faster than having to dwell through websites and pages. That's what I'm thinking.
So I've used it also recently where I did the transcription myself, but now this Natalie AI is being built to do audio to text transcription in any language. It will transcribe it, and then you can do like a language sample analysis. But your prompt has to be specific. So you have to tell Natalie, like, I want you to analyze this for the following morphological morphemes. You know, did the child use pronouns? Did the child use verb inflection? Did the child use passive, active types of sentences? And I've gotten really good results. So I've asked to describe. And then you can also use this AI to create your SOAP notes. Again, from audio recordings, it transcribes it to you, and then you ask it to summarize your session. It's just about getting used to starting your recording and thinking out loud as you're doing your session. So being like, oh, okay, I see that maybe this was a little bit more difficult for you. Let me give you a little more help, and kind of saying what you're doing out loud as you're doing it. You're kind of already dictating your analysis. And then it can also summarize these sessions for you and translate it in any language you want to send to families who don't speak the language. So, and this is generated in seconds. It can generate worksheets. It can generate word lists with specific sounds. I've done this in French and English so far, and I've gotten really nice results. Sometimes you got to kind of tweak it. But anyways, I was just curious to know.
What you're saying is amazing. I love it. I'm curious, have you tried the language sample analysis with any other language other than French and English?
So I've tried it with one of my participants sent me a recording of her and her children speaking in Arabic, and there wasn't a lot of talking during the audio, but yes, it did tell me. I asked AI to analyze the types of sentences that the child was producing and the type of support, because I could hear that, because I understand enough Arabic to be able to understand the session and the interaction, and it analyzed the mom's interaction with the child, what types of prompts the mom was giving, like the mom was modeling, the child was repeating, and it gave me all of that description. So of course, AI will replace us, but can definitely, with all the paperwork that we have, if we learn to adopt it in the right way and use the right types of prompts, it's going to take a little bit of tweaking, but I think it's definitely an avenue that will help us lessen our paper load and focus more on what we really love to do. So anyways, I'll share the link if anyone's interested. It's our colleague Yvon Blais who's developed this with a partner, and I'm just freaking out over the potential that this has for the field, and even summarizing research articles. I've used it to like creating quizzes from, I've put together a lot of workshops, I'm sure you have as well, creating quizzes from content that you already have, that you've summarized yourself, creating summaries. If you wanted to do a presentation for someone, again, it's like your virtual assistant, but it's been programmed for SLPs specifically, and you can feed it things like your code de déontologie. I don't know how you say that in English. It's been programmed to write the SOAP notes, for example, to be conformed to our code, what our code requires. Yeah.
Wow.
Obviously, you'd have to read it over and make sure, and then you might say, oh, this wasn't in the workshop, I'll add a little bit of this. But it's really something I think we especially working with multilingual, multicultural families, it can't take away the human aspect of it, but it can definitely help translating, communicating. If we don't have access to interpreters, this happens so often. I'm still like brainstorming and exploring how much more we can use this type of technology, which is only going to be growing and going forward. So anyways, if anyone's interested, I'll share.
I'm definitely interested. So I'm curious to see what you find out, and please share it with us.
Yeah, and I do think that there's like a free trial if people do want to try out Natalie, because there's like Chat GPT for everyone knows about that, but Natalie has been fed information, reports, assessment, a lot of things based on the field to be able to best serve SLPs. And there's a knowledge base too, like you were saying, if you wanted to know specific things about a specific language, you could probably go and get a lot of that in there.
Well, I like it.
Anyways, thank you
Me
so
too.
much. We went a little over time. I really appreciate your time and all the beautiful information you shared with us. Thank you for coming on. And happy Better Speech and Hearing Month to everyone. And we'll have another live on Wednesday and on Friday to wrap up this big month. Thank you so much, Sandrine.
Thank you so much, Melissa.